He invited Keanu Reeves to inspire a global summit. What happened instead left the entire audience in stunned silence. Booed before he even spoke a word, Keanu faced a wall of hostility from hundreds. But what he did next didn't just quiet the room. It changed everything. Why was he being attacked? And why did he stay? Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The SUV slowed to a crawl as it approached the curb outside the Civic Grand Pavilion in San Francisco. The sleek black vehicle stood out against the steel-gray clouds above and the anxious movement of the crowd below. This wasn't a red carpet event, and the tension in the air made that unmistakably clear. Keanu Reeves sat in the back seat, his eyes fixed on the sidewalk through the tinted glass. At first glance, it looked like a gathering of passionate film fans, until the details came into focus. Handmade signs rose above heads. One read, "Actors shouldn't evict families." Another shouted in bold red marker, "Hollywood doesn't care about the poor." A third, "Reeves profits while we sleep in cars." There were no cheers, no smiling faces, no reaching hands. Only frowns, furrowed brows, and the sharp intensity of people who felt betrayed. Keanu said nothing, but his jaw tightened as he slowly exhaled. His assistant, seated in the front passenger seat, turned around, worry written all over her face. "We were told it wouldn't be this bad," she said gently. "The summit organizers said there might be a few protesters, but this..." Keanu's gaze remained steady on the crowd. The energy was unmistakable. These people weren't here to hear him speak. They were here to confront him. The assistant hesitated. "There's a side entrance we can use. If we loop around, security will clear a path to backstage. It'll be safer." He finally looked at her. Not angry, not defensive, just calm. "And what would that teach them?" he asked quietly. She didn't respond. She didn't have to. They both knew what it would look like. Him sneaking in the back door while people outside stood in the cold with their stories, their signs, and their rage. The driver pulled to a full stop. The windows now reflected the faces pressed close, some holding their signs high, others filming with their phones. Keanu took one more breath, then reached for the door handle. The assistant placed a hand on his arm. "They think you did this?" she said, voice soft. "They think you had something to do with the evictions." "I know you didn't." "Ah, I know that too." And with that, he stepped out. The moment his boots hit the pavement, a low ripple of sound moved through the crowd. It wasn't applause, it wasn't even shouting. It was the murmured buzz of people recognizing him, registering the fact that he hadn't hidden. He had walked straight into it. Then, as if triggered by his very presence, the first shout rang out. "You're no hero, Keanu." Another followed. "You let families be thrown out of their homes?" Phones came up. Someone live-streamed. The signs swayed harder now. Hands gripped tighter. The sidewalk that had been just a scene of protest had now become a trial ground. Keanu kept walking. Slow, purposeful, not flinching, not reacting. He didn't argue. He didn't wave or smile. He just moved through them, absorbing every word, every glare, every insult. And they watched him do it. A woman in a red windbreaker stepped directly in front of him. Her eyes were sharp with pain, not just anger. "My grandmother lived in one of those buildings," she said, voice quivering. "They gave her 3 days to leave. 3 days. She didn't even have time to pack her wedding photos." Keanu stopped. He didn't step around her. He didn't interrupt. He listened. "I watched her cry on the front steps like she was trash," the woman continued. "You think you're better than us because you make movies? Because you smile on TV?" He shook his head slowly. "No, I don't think that." Her jaw trembled, but she didn't yell again. She stepped aside. He kept walking, this time past a young man in a hoodie holding up a sign that read, "Reeves ruins neighborhoods." The man didn't say anything, just stared with cold judgment in his eyes. Keanu met the gaze, nodded once in acknowledgement, and moved forward. The summit's main entrance loomed ahead, ornate glass doors, 2 security guards, and a pair of organizers standing just beyond them, clearly uncomfortable. One of them spoke into a headset, while the other gestured frantically toward Keanu's assistant, who was catching up behind him. Inside the venue, cameras were already in place. Journalists with credentials hanging from lanyards had been ushered into their assigned seating. Some glanced at their phones, seeing the live streams. They whispered updates to each other. The protest had followed him to the steps. The crowd began to chant now, not just shout. Keanu profits, families pay. Still he didn't rush. Still he didn't hide. As he reached the bottom of the grand staircase leading into the building, a teenage boy, no older than 16, called out to him from the edge of the crowd. "Did you even read the contract before you signed it?" Keanu turned toward him. The boy's voice cracked with emotion, and he looked embarrassed after speaking, but it was too late to take the words back. Keanu gave a soft, nearly imperceptible nod. "I didn't read far enough," he replied, "and that was a mistake." The chanting faltered for a brief moment. Not enough to stop, but enough to create a pause. That pause echoed louder than any megaphone. His assistant finally reached him, her face pale. "They're not going to let you speak if this keeps up. They're thinking of canceling." Keanu didn't answer. He kept walking until he stood at the foot of the building. A security guard opened the glass door hesitantly. A final voice from the crowd shouted, "Why'd you even come? Just to save your image?" Keanu paused with one hand on the door. He looked over his shoulder, his voice calm, clear, and low. "No. I came to listen." And with that, he stepped inside. Inside the foyer, the noise from outside was muffled but still present, like distant thunder rattling behind glass. The lobby's polished marble floors and golden light fixtures seemed completely out of place compared to the raw tension just beyond the doors. It was like walking from a storm into a museum. Keanu's footsteps echoed as he made his way past the registration table. Volunteers glanced at him nervously, some unsure whether to offer a greeting or look away. One young woman behind the check-in desk whispered something to her colleague. Her badge read, "Media Relations Intern." The colleague just shook his head and continued typing. At the far end of the lobby, Sarah Ortega, the summit's executive director, hurried down the steps from the balcony level. She looked like she hadn't slept in days, suit slightly rumpled, phone pressed to her ear, eyes darting in every direction. When she saw Keanu, she ended the call mid-sentence and rushed toward him. "Keanu," she said, breathless, "we're so sorry. We had no idea the response would be like this. We tried controlling it, but..." She motioned toward the glass doors behind him. "It just exploded overnight." Keanu nodded once. "Let them be angry," he said. "They deserve to be." Sarah blinked, unsure how to respond. Are you still planning to speak?" He met her eyes with calm resolve. "If they'll let me." She looked like she might cry, from relief and dread at the same time. "They will," she said quietly. "But it's tense in there. Some of the other speakers are worried about what this means for the event's image." Keanu didn't flinch. "This is the event's image now. If we can't handle that, we shouldn't be here." Sarah gave a small, nervous nod and gestured toward the main hallway. "We've got a quiet room backstage if you need a few moments before you go on. You're scheduled to close the summit. We still have 2 panels before you. I'll wait in the wings." As he walked past the registration desk, one of the interns suddenly called out behind him, "Mr. Reeves?" He turned. "I saw the article, the one that said you displaced the tenants." I didn't believe it. He didn't respond at first. Then he offered a small smile, sad and tired. "You should have. I didn't stop it." The intern nodded solemnly. With that, Keanu disappeared behind the curtain leading to the backstage corridor. Inside the auditorium, stagehands adjusted microphones. Rows of chairs faced a wide mahogany stage. Journalists began to file in. There was still an hour until he would be introduced. But already, a current was moving through the building. The protest was no longer just outside. It had made its way into every whispered conversation, every glance, every tightened jaw and crossed arm. Keanu stood backstage, completely still. He wasn't preparing a speech. He was preparing for silence. And the moment he stepped out, nothing would ever be the same. Backstage, the tension was thick enough to stop conversations mid-sentence. Keanu Reeves stepped into the wings of the auditorium, where crew members in black headsets moved quickly around cables and camera rigs. Normally, backstage was filled with excitement and focus. Today, it felt like a waiting room before a storm. To his left, two crew members stood near the lighting console, whispering just a bit too loudly. Is he actually going through with it? Sure did. Did you hear the crowd during the last panel? I did. Someone said he should apologize or walk. Keanu could hear every word. He didn't flinch. One of the techs noticed and turned away, embarrassed. Keanu didn't say anything. He simply walked over to the soundboard operator, an older man with a gentle expression and calloused hands, and gave him a quiet, "Thank you." "For what?" the man asked, surprised. "For being here," Keanu replied. A young stagehand nearby dropped a stack of printed cue cards. They scattered across the concrete floor, pages skidding toward the green room door. She froze, startled. Keanu immediately knelt down and helped gather them. "Thank you," she whispered. He handed her the last page. "You got it," he said softly. The green room, just feet away, had gone silent. Inside, a group of high-profile panelists and keynote speakers sat together, murmuring nervously. A few of them had already spoken earlier in the day. One, a tech entrepreneur, another, a former senator turned media advisor, and a third, a well-known documentary filmmaker. When Keanu entered the room briefly to wait for his introduction, two of them stopped talking and quietly stood up. They excused themselves and walked out without looking at him. One of the remaining speakers, a man with graying hair and expensive shoes, glanced up from his phone. "I wouldn't go out there if I were you," he said casually. "It's not your crowd tonight." Keanu didn't respond. He sat on the edge of the chair near the wall, hands folded, calm. No defense, no explanation. From the stage, the muffled voice of the event's announcer came through the monitor speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our closing keynote speaker, Mr. Keanu Reeves." Then came the sound. Not applause, but something else entirely. It began as a low wave of murmuring, then surged into loud, unmistakable booing. The sound didn't taper. It grew. From backstage, Keanu could hear it rising like a wall of rejection. It wasn't spontaneous. It was coordinated, full-bodied, and deliberate. Dozens, possibly hundreds of people had made up their minds before he even reached the microphone. The announcer's voice faltered on the mic, caught off guard by the hostility. Keanu stood up slowly and stepped toward the curtain, waiting for his cue. From inside the auditorium, camera flashes lit the dimmed room like lightning strikes. A chant started near the front rows and swept quickly toward the back. "Not our voice! Not our voice!" Someone shouted, "Fraud!" Another voice followed, louder and sharper. "Say sorry or get off the stage!" The booing pulsed like a heartbeat through the theater. A backstage coordinator in a headset, barely out of college, looked visibly shaken. She turned to Keanu, hand hovering near the walkie clipped to her belt. "We can call security," she said quickly. "We can clear a path out the back. You don't have to go on." Keanu looked at her with steady eyes. "They're not angry at me. They're angry at what they think I did." She hesitated. "But, are you sure you want to do this?" He nodded once. "It's not about being sure. It's about being present." And with that, He stepped past her toward the curtain. Stagehands holding clipboards froze. One gripped a headset tighter, mouth open as if to speak, but stopped himself. Keanu didn't pause. He moved forward slowly and calmly, as if he weren't stepping into hostility, but into a space that needed to be filled, with stillness, not resistance. The booing did not let up. As he approached the stage entrance, the noise became deafening. Rows of seated attendees leaned forward, shouting over one another. A few turned their backs in protest. Every eye was trained on the wings, waiting for him to emerge. Some were ready to jeer louder. Others, despite their anger, simply watched, curious what kind of man would walk into this storm without flinching. Keanu crossed the threshold into the light. No microphone in hand, no notes, no smile, just silence in his steps, and noise all around him. The moment Keanu stepped into the spotlight, the booing intensified. It wasn't just noise, it was fury sharpened by disappointment. Dozens of faces contorted with frustration, betrayal, and pain. Some held their signs high, others pointed fingers, and a few simply shook their heads as if they couldn't believe he had the audacity to show up at all. Keanu didn't react. He didn't wave. He didn't motion for quiet. He just walked to the podium, one foot after the other, steady and slow. Someone in the middle rows shouted, "Why are you here?" Another, "We don't need your fake humility." Phones recorded every second. Live streams surged with comments. People online debated whether this was bravery or arrogance. But Keanu wasn't performing. He wasn't playing to the cameras. He reached the center of the stage and stopped. For a long moment, he simply stood there, looking out into the crowd, not scanning over them like a politician, but locking eyes, row by row, person by person. The booing continued, then wavered, then pulsed in and out. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't move at all. A kind of stillness settled over him, quiet and unshakable. He wasn't fighting the noise. He was absorbing it. Backstage, the stage manager whispered, "Is he going to speak?" No one answered. From the front row, a woman shouted, "You could have fixed this. Why didn't you?" Keanu blinked once, his jaw steady. But still, he said nothing. The crowd's shouting softened, not out of satisfaction, but confusion. They had expected rebuttals, security intervention, maybe even a walk-off. But they hadn't expected nothing. Not passive, nothing. Still, grounded, listening, nothing. The absence of reaction became its own kind of statement, like the calm inside a storm that refuses to match its violence. Gradually, the chants grew uneven. A few people sat down, a handful lowered their signs. Some of the loudest voices had gone quiet, uncertain what they were yelling against anymore. Keanu remained. The silence wasn't total, the anger hadn't disappeared, but something had changed, and he hadn't spoken a word yet. The spotlight burned overhead as Keanu stood at the podium, completely still. The audience was a sea of faces, some twisted in anger, some frozen in confusion, others quietly waiting to see what would happen next. But the majority were shouting, booing, demanding. The noise filled every inch of the grand auditorium. Echoes bounced off the curved ceiling and walls, turning individual voices into one overwhelming wave of rejection. It was the kind of sound that made it hard to think, hard to breathe, hard to stand. Still, he didn't move. He didn't grip the sides of the podium. He didn't lean forward to the microphone. He didn't even adjust his posture. Keanu simply stood there with his hands resting loosely in front of him, eyes calm, breath steady. Someone in the balcony threw a crumpled piece of paper. It landed harmlessly near the foot of the stage. The security guards at the exits remained in place, instructed not to interfere unless violence erupted. The tension in the room was now more than noise. It was temperature. It was pressure. And Keanu didn't react. He slowly closed his eyes. He wasn't ignoring them. It wasn't defiance. It looked almost like he was searching inside himself for the right place to stand. Not physically, but emotionally. A few people in the middle rows began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. One woman with a scarf wrapped tightly around her neck looked away, embarrassed by the volume of those around her. A man beside her kept booing, but his voice sounded weaker, as if unsure whether he should still be shouting. The silence on stage was louder than the crowd. Keanu opened his eyes again. He didn't look shaken. He didn't look triumphant. He looked present. Someone toward the back yelled, "Say something already!" We didn't. A few more seconds passed. Then more. The booing surged again, trying to fill the space that his silence had created. But something had started to feel different. It wasn't just him standing still. It was the fact that he hadn't flinched once. Not once. People had expected him to break, to interrupt, to walk off, to defend. Instead, he just stood and listened. The crowd didn't know what to do with that kind of silence. They had come prepared for a fight, not for someone who refused to fight back. Every time the energy built, expecting confrontation, Keanu absorbed it without retaliation. It confused people. It disarmed them. A young woman near the front clutched a rolled-up sign tightly in her lap. She had shouted with full force just minutes ago, but now she was just staring at him. Her eyes flickered between uncertainty and awe. She hadn't stopped being angry, but she was now wondering why he hadn't lashed out. Another man near the center leaned to whisper to the person beside him. "Where am I speaking?" His companion shrugged, still frowning. "He's trying to make us feel guilty." But it didn't feel like guilt. It felt like space. Keanu's silence wasn't cold or manipulative. It was stillness. It was acknowledgement without words. He wasn't saying, "You're wrong." He wasn't saying anything at all. And somehow, that made it harder to hold on to the outrage. The organizers' staff stood frozen behind the curtains. One of them nervously checked the time. They had slotted 45 minutes for Keanu's address. He had been standing on stage in total silence for nearly 5 of them already. The crowd was restless. The sound technician backstage looked at the stage manager and whispered, "Should we fade the mic in now?" But the manager shook his head. He hasn't moved. Then, for the first time, Keanu looked down, just briefly, and touched the edge of the podium. His fingers curled over the side, not gripping, but anchoring. Then he looked back at the crowd, his expression unchanged. He saw them, the ones who shouted, the ones who cried, the ones who had come to challenge him, and the ones who came only to watch it unfold. And still, he said nothing. The surreal quality of the moment began to spread. A quiet ripple moved through the auditorium. Not everyone stopped yelling, but more and more did. Some paused mid-chant, realizing that no one around them had joined in. Others lowered their phones, confused that this wasn't going the way they expected. No one had prepared for the possibility that Keanu wouldn't respond at all. One man stood in the aisle, arms crossed tightly over his chest, his sign slung under his elbow. He had rehearsed what he would yell. He had practiced the exact moment to interrupt. But now, standing there, watching Keanu Reeves remain unmoved, he felt something he hadn't expected. Doubt, not about the cause, not about the anger, but about the man in front of them. A slow hush began to trickle through the theater, not total silence, but an uneven quiet, like the tail end of a thunderstorm. The louder voices tried to push through it, repeating their chants, forcing their anger back into the air. But their rhythm had been broken. The unity of the protest inside the auditorium had fractured, and Keanu hadn't said a single word. One of the speakers from earlier in the day, seated in a reserved row, whispered to the person next to him, "This is strange." The other whispered back, "It's working." Backstage, a woman from the planning committee whispered, I've never seen anything like this. Near the stage's edge, a photographer slowly lowered his camera. He had come to capture a scandal. Instead, he found himself documenting something far quieter and far more powerful. Keanu remained at the podium, his breathing calm and even. He looked out into the crowd again, not searching for approval, but simply seeing them. The people who had booed the loudest now sat with uncertainty in their eyes. They hadn't forgiven. They hadn't forgotten. But they were no longer yelling. That quiet, that thin thread of stillness stretching between him and hundreds of people, felt more tense than any shouting match. It wasn't over. The room was still charged with conflict, but now there was something else. Curiosity. What would he say when he finally did speak? Would he fight back? Would he deny the allegations? Would he beg for understanding? Or would he do something no one expected? Keanu blinked slowly, then lowered his eyes once more, just for a breath. The moment hovered. A room filled with judgment had turned into a room full of waiting for something they didn't even know they needed. And Keanu was still just standing there, in the quiet aftermath of rage, waiting with them. Minutes passed. Real minutes, not rushed or filled with nervous gestures, just Keanu standing there, calm in a sea of uncertainty. The air had shifted from hostile to still, not out of peace, but out of confusion. The silence wasn't comfortable. It was tense, loaded, raw. And then he moved. Not his whole body, just one hand. He slowly raised it, palm open, no more than shoulder height. It wasn't a command for quiet. It wasn't a dramatic flourish. It was acknowledgement, a soft gesture, like a wave from someone recognizing a familiar pain in the eyes of a stranger. He didn't pair it with words. He didn't try to signal power or control. The hand simply rose, held steady for a few seconds, then gently lowered again. In the front row, a woman tilted her head slightly. Her hands, which had been clenched around a protest flyer, loosened. In the row behind her, a man leaned forward, waiting. From the center aisle, a camera shutter clicked. Somewhere near the back, a child coughed. And just like that, the silence widened. A pocket of stillness formed in the front section, an unspoken response to his gesture. Not surrender, not approval, but readiness. Keanu took in the room again. He didn't scan like a politician looking for applause. He made eye contact, briefly but intentionally, with several faces in the audience. Some looked away immediately, others held his gaze, uncertain what they were allowing themselves to feel. A young man in the third row shifted in his seat. His protest sign, black marker on white foam board, read, "You used us." His grip loosened. The sign slid down to his knees. Keanu noticed. Still without speaking, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It had been creased and recreased, smoothed and folded again. Whatever was written inside had been written before this moment. Prepared. Probably rehearsed. He placed it on the podium gently, like something fragile. Then, finally, he spoke. "I wrote something," he said, his voice soft but audible, cutting clearly through the theater. He looked down at the paper, then back up. "But maybe I need to say something else first." The crowd held still, the quiet deepening not by force, but by choice. No one had asked them to stop shouting. No one had demanded respect. Yet it was forming anyway, gathering slowly, like mist settling on water. Keanu looked down at the folded page again, letting the moment breathe. He didn't rush. He didn't try to capitalize on the quiet. He let it happen naturally. A woman halfway up the left aisle sat forward, elbows on her knees. Her sign rested face down at her feet. Her lips parted slightly, as if ready to interrupt. But she didn't. She watched him, waiting. Keanu stepped slightly away from the microphone, just one pace back from the podium, not retreating, just loosening the formality. He placed both hands together in front of him and looked directly into the crowd. "I know why many of you are here," he said gently. "And I want you to know I've thought about this night every day for the past 3 weeks." The room stayed still. I didn't come here to argue with anyone. I didn't come to justify headlines or spin stories. I came because people were hurt, and I was part of something that let that happen. A murmur ran through the second balcony. A woman there wiped her eyes without realizing it. Her friend glanced at her, surprised. Keanu's tone never rose. It didn't need to. He didn't speak like someone trying to win people back. He spoke like someone trying to understand why he'd lost their trust in the first place. "I didn't choose the filming location," he continued, "but I also didn't ask the questions I should have. I was told everything was above board, that no residents would be affected, and I believed it, because believing it was easier than checking." More people shifted in their seats, not because they disagreed, but because vulnerability wasn't what they expected. And that's what I regret. No excuses, no redirection, just that single sentence hanging there. A man in a blazer leaned over and whispered to the woman beside him, "He's actually owning it." She didn't reply. Her arms were crossed, but her posture had softened. On stage, Keanu took another breath. "You deserve the truth," he said. "But before I get to that, before I read you anything I prepared, I just want to ask you to hear me. Not forgive, not forget. Just hear me." No one spoke. No one moved. For the first time since the summit began, the auditorium was united. Not in outrage, not in applause, but in attention. Keanu stepped forward again, back to the podium, his fingertips resting gently on its edge. "I've spent most of my life learning lines," he said, "memorizing scripts, delivering scenes. But this isn't a performance. And if it were, I'd be failing." A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the room, not from humor, but from recognition. "But what I am learning now," he added, "is how dangerous it is when we stop listening and start assuming." He turned his head slightly, addressing the left side of the auditorium. "I assumed my team had done the due diligence. I assumed the studio would never put profit over people. And I assumed that my name, just being attached to something, wouldn't hurt anyone." He paused. The silence pressed in closer. "But I was wrong." 3 simple words. They landed like a stone dropped into still water. Keanu opened the folded paper slowly. It crackled as he flattened it with care. The audience expected him to begin reading, but he didn't. Not yet. "I wrote this to honor the voices I hadn't heard before," he said. "The ones who were displaced, the ones who were ignored, the ones who were told by an industry they didn't matter." He looked up. "But maybe the most important thing tonight isn't what I wrote." He folded the paper again and set it beside the mic. "Maybe it's what I'm willing to say that wasn't rehearsed." He scanned the audience slowly. "If you want to walk out," he said, "I won't hold it against you." No one moved. "If you want to challenge me," he added, "I'll stay here and answer you." Still, no one moved. "But if there's even a small part of you willing to believe that I didn't come here to defend my image, but to hear your anger and to learn from it, then maybe, just maybe, we can have a conversation." From the third row, the young man who had lowered his sign earlier now held it in his lap. He looked down at it, then back up at Keanu. And for the first time that night, he nodded. Keanu nodded back. No theatrics, no applause, just 2 human beings seeing each other. Keanu let the silence linger just a moment longer before speaking again. "I know some of you are angry," he said, his voice low but steady. "I would be too." The words weren't spoken as a strategy. They weren't designed to win anyone over. They came from somewhere quieter, more personal. "I didn't come here to change your minds," he continued, "and I'm not here to convince you that I deserve your forgiveness. That's not mine to ask for." Some heads turned in the crowd. The cameras, still recording, caught the subtle expressions changing, anger softening into curiosity, tension into awareness. "I didn't cause the eviction," Keanu said, "but that doesn't mean I was blameless. I didn't ask the right questions. I didn't look close enough. I trusted the process because it was easier than challenging it." His voice shook, not from fear, but from something heavier: regret. "I trusted people I've worked with for years. I believed them when they told me the production site was clean, no one would be displaced, that everyone had been compensated. I didn't double-check. I didn't stop to ask the people who actually lived there." He paused, pressing his fingers together, grounding himself. "That's what I regret most." A woman in the audience, seated near the middle, wiped a tear from her cheek and didn't try to hide it. The man next to her looked over and reached for her hand. Neither of them had spoken a word since Keanu took the stage. "There was a woman named Isabel," he said. "I read about her after everything happened. 68 years old. She'd lived in her apartment for over 30 years. She raised 2 daughters there. One of them passed away a few years ago from cancer. That apartment was all she had left of her. And she lost it." He looked down for a moment. "She didn't even know who I was, really. Just said she saw me in a movie once. But now she knows my name? Because her life was disrupted while people filmed a scene I stood in." He didn't try to dramatize it. He just said it plainly. And in that simplicity, the room grew quieter still. Keanu lifted his eyes again, scanning the rows before him. He wasn't looking for sympathy. He wasn't trying to control the moment. He was just there. Present. Accountable. "I think sometimes we forget that behind every decision, every headline, every schedule, there are people," he said. "Not just numbers or names, but people who sleep in those homes. People with family photos on the wall. People with routines, memories, grief, laughter, lives." He paused to breathe. "And when we bulldoze through those lives in the name of entertainment or business or efficiency, we don't just move their furniture. We move their stories. We erase things we never had the right to touch." A single clap echoed in the back corner. It wasn't followed, but no one hushed it either. Keanu continued, "I'm not standing here as a celebrity tonight. I'm not standing here as a voice for a project or a campaign or a film. I'm standing here because someone trusted me with a platform, and I didn't use it to protect people. I used it to assume everything was fine." He stepped slightly to the side of the podium, letting his shadow break from the spotlight. "I can't go back and stop what happened to Isabel. I can't change the fact that I didn't see her until it was too late. But I can tell you, her story changed something in me. It made me start asking questions I should have asked long ago." There were no interruptions, no jeers, just the sound of breathing and occasional shifting as people leaned forward, listening. "I read the reports," he added. "Not the polished ones. The real ones. The handwritten complaints, the eviction notices, the appeals that no one answered. I sat with them for days. And I realized I had treated silence as neutrality." He looked down again, his voice lowered. "But silence, in situations like that, isn't neutral. It's permission." A young woman near the front, who had been clutching her protest sign to her chest like armor, lowered it slowly to her lap. She didn't let go of it. But she no longer held it like a weapon. Keanu stood taller. "I came here tonight not to fix what's broken, but to name it," he said. "Because if I can't even say it out loud, then I don't deserve this stage." "I didn't lose a home because of what happened," Keanu continued quietly. "But I lost something else. I lost the illusion that good intentions are enough." The auditorium was completely still. "Intent doesn't shelter families," he said. "It doesn't protect children from sleeping in cars. It doesn't preserve memories inside 4 walls when the lock's been changed." He took another breath, slow and steady, then turned slightly to the side, speaking now as if addressing someone not in the room. "I thought I had done enough by being kind on set, by donating in private, by not causing harm." He shook his head gently. "But sometimes harm happens, not because we act with cruelty, but because we don't act At all. A rustle moved through the seats as someone stood up in the back, not to protest, but simply to stand, arms folded. Watching. "I want you to know," Keanu said, "that this isn't the end of what I have to say, but it might be the most important part." He returned to center stage and looked out at the crowd again. "Because if I'm not willing to be honest about my failure, if I only show up when things go right, then everything I've ever said about compassion, about listening, about respect, it's just performance." Another pause. "And I won't let my life become a performance." For a moment, that statement settled in the room like a final note of music, one that didn't fade, but held. Someone in the audience cleared their throat. A woman pulled out a tissue. A man who had been furiously taking notes now simply looked up, eyes glassy, pen forgotten in his hand. Keanu's voice softened. "If I've earned your anger, I accept it. If I've broken your trust, I'll work to earn it back. Not through promises, but through actions. And if you still believe I don't belong here tonight, I understand." Then, for the first time since arriving, he smiled. Not broadly, just enough to be real. "But I hope you'll let me stay, and I hope you'll let me listen." The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full of grief, of understanding, of something human rising in place of outrage. And as Keanu stood waiting for whatever came next, even those who still carried pain began to listen. Keanu took a step back from the podium. He didn't look down at the paper anymore. His hands dropped to his sides, loose, almost vulnerable. "There's something I've never shared publicly," he said. "Not in interviews, not in speeches, not even with people I've worked with for decades." Auditorium leaned in. Some people shifted forward instinctively in their chairs. He looked up at the lights, then down at the rows of faces before him. "When I was 15, he said, "my mother and I were evicted." A hush fell over the crowd. No gasps, no murmurs, just silence. "We lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in Toronto," he continued. "It wasn't much. The wallpaper peeled in the corners, the heat clanked like it was coughing, but it was ours." He paused, his jaw tightening slightly. "My mom had been out of work for a while. She was doing what she could, taking small sewing jobs, cleaning offices at night. But it wasn't enough. I remember the knock on the door, 3 sharp knocks. Keanu's eyes were distant now, as if the room had faded and the memory had returned in full color. He opened it and just stood there. The man had a clipboard and a folded notice. He didn't yell, he wasn't cruel, but he said we had to be out in 72 hours. A few audience members exchanged looks. Some had experienced similar moments. Others were simply absorbing the rawness of his voice. "I didn't know what to do," Keanu said. "I was 15. I didn't know anything about rent or paperwork or legal rights. I just knew my mom sat down on the floor after he left and cried. I had never seen her do that before." He swallowed, blinking once. "I watched her press her forehead to the edge of the couch and sob while I stood there, holding a box of cereal. I didn't know whether to hug her or pretend I hadn't seen." The room was absolutely still. "Imali came 3 days later," he said. "A moving crew, not friends, not family, just strangers doing their job. They carried out our furniture like we were a task on a checklist." He exhaled. "That's what eviction feels like." Keanu looked around the room, the weight of that memory pressing quietly between his words. "I carried out a lamp," he said. "It was the only thing I could do that felt useful. A floor lamp with a crooked shade. My mom had bought it at a thrift store years earlier. We used to read under it." His voice didn't crack, but it softened, thinned by emotion. "She kept apologizing to me, to the movers, even to the landlord who never showed up. I don't think she knew what else to say. It wasn't her fault, but she still blamed herself. That's what poverty does. It teaches you to carry shame for things you never caused." Several people in the audience wiped their eyes quietly. Keanu continued. "We moved into a friend's basement for a few months. It was damp. It smelled like laundry soap and mildew, but I never complained. I didn't want her to think I was still hurting. He gave a faint smile. She'd make peanut butter sandwiches and pretend it was all temporary. She'd say, "This is just a pause, baby. Life has pauses." He let those words hang there, and she was right. Eventually, we found another place, smaller, fewer windows, but it was a place to start over. He looked out over the silent crowd. I've carried that story with me my entire life. Quietly, privately, not because I was ashamed, but because it felt too sacred to explain. He reached up, gently adjusting the microphone for the first time. When I signed on to that film project, the one that caused so much harm, I was drawn to it because of its message. It was about survival, about dignity, about people who lose everything but find a way back. He paused, his hands resting lightly on the podium. I thought I was honoring stories like my mother's. I thought I was telling the truth about people like her. The quiet in the auditorium deepened. Even the hum of the lights above felt distant now. But the truth is, while we were filming scenes about fictional evictions, real ones were happening just off camera, and I didn't see them. He looked down at the floor, then back up again. That's the part that still breaks me. I walked by the trailers. I walked by the sets. I walked by the security guards posted at every corner, Keanu said, voice quiet but unwavering. But I didn't walk by the residents being forced out. He let that admission settle. Because by the time I arrived, they were already gone. A few heads bowed in the audience. Others remained locked on him, not blinking, afraid to miss a word. I talked with the director about the script's emotional honesty, he continued. We spent hours discussing how to make the dialogue feel authentic. And still, I miss the most important part, the real people, the real pain behind the lens. He looked over to stage left, as if seeing a memory rather than a person. I used to think that making films about hardship was enough, that bringing those stories to light justified the way we told them. But now I understand telling stories about struggle doesn't mean you are excused from the responsibility of what your presence might do in someone's real life. He took a breath. That's why I joined that film project, he said, to honor people like my mom, to show that survival could be beautiful and defiant and human. He shook his head gently, but I didn't realize the real story was happening behind the scenes. He stepped slightly away from the podium again, his body language open, exposed. It's a strange thing to admit that your greatest regret isn't what you did, but what you failed to see. A young man in the back, who had been silent since Keanu walked on stage, lowered his sign and leaned against the seat in front of him. His face wasn't angry anymore. It was searching. And that's why I'm here, Keanu said. Not because I was told to be, not because my publicist begged me to save face, but because I've been on both sides of that door. He looked out across the crowd one more time, not just with clarity, but with weight. And I know what it's like to be on the outside of a home you can never return to. The auditorium remained silent, not cold, not skeptical, just breathless and still listening. Keanu stood still, his hands lightly resting on the edges of the podium again. The quiet had become so complete that the sound of someone shifting in their chair or clearing their throat echoed like a drumbeat. The energy in the room was no longer hostile. It was raw, exposed, and waiting. He looked directly at the crowd, not scanning past them, but locking eyes with them, one person at a time, without fear or defensiveness. I didn't come here to defend myself, he said. I came to say I'm sorry. The words didn't crash down like a dramatic confession. They arrived softly, plainly, and landed with quiet gravity. I didn't know people had been hurt, he said. I should have known, and that's on me. His voice thickened slightly on the last line, not breaking but deepening, just enough to reveal the truth of what was underneath. He didn't wipe his eyes. He didn't turn away. He just stood there and let the moment hold him. I didn't walk those streets before filming began. I didn't speak to the residents. I didn't ask how production might impact the lives of people already struggling. I trusted someone else to handle it. And they didn't. But that doesn't make me innocent. A few audience members sat back in their chairs, not out of disagreement, but out of realization. It was rare to hear someone in his position own harm without excuses. No shifting of blame, no polished language, just full responsibility. No speech could undo what happened, he said, but silence won't either. So, here I am. A woman sitting near the front wiped her cheeks. She had been one of the most vocal critics before the event, quoted in articles, even interviewed by local press. Now she sat motionless, holding her phone in her lap but not recording. Behind her, a younger man stared forward, eyes glassy. His protest sign leaned against the leg of his chair, forgotten. I know an apology doesn't bring people back to their homes, Keanu said. It doesn't rebuild trust or restore dignity, but it's where I need to start. His tone wasn't rehearsed. It carried no rhythm meant to sway. It was the tone of someone who had made peace with discomfort and chose to remain in it. And I want you to know, he added, I'm not asking for your forgiveness. I'm asking for your attention, because I know I didn't earn it before. Several rows back, a protester who had entered the auditorium with arms crossed and brows furrowed now sat leaning forward. His sign, once clutched like a weapon, rested face down beneath his seat. Tears welled in his eyes, though he didn't seem to notice. It was as if Keanu's words had turned the room into a mirror, not just for the speaker, but for everyone listening. Keanu drew a long breath, steadying himself. Then he continued. I used to think the worst thing I could be was wrong, he said. But I've learned that the worst thing I can be is unreachable. He let that settle. I became unreachable when I stayed quiet. When I let others speak for me. When I thought showing up on set with a good attitude was enough. It wasn't. It never is. The audience listened closely now. This wasn't just a public apology. It was personal reconstruction, built in real time. I didn't know Isabel. I never met her. But I've read her eviction notice. I've seen the photos of the apartment after she was forced to leave. I've looked at the dust outlines on the wall where her family pictures once hung. His voice caught slightly. A pause followed. Then he went on. I didn't ask to be the face of that pain, but I became it anyway, because my silence allowed it. The weight in his voice pressed gently against every corner of the room. A man near the right aisle lowered his head, eyes fixed on the carpet. He had arrived angry, determined to walk out midway in protest. But now he stayed, unsure of what to do with the unexpected empathy blooming inside him. I came here tonight, Keanu said, to stand in the space I tried to avoid. Not because I think it'll fix what happened, but because I believe people deserve to hear the words. They were denied from the beginning. He stepped to the side again, away from the microphone, and clasped his hands together. I'm sorry for not showing up when it counted most. I'm sorry for speaking only after others were silenced. I'm sorry for letting comfort keep me quiet. Another moment passed, and I'm sorry I didn't say all of this sooner. Somewhere near the back, someone began to cry. Not loudly, just a quiet release of something that had been held too long. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of breath, of memory, of recognition. People weren't just hearing an apology, they were feeling it, seeing it unfold in a way that didn't rush to fix or plead or defend. Keanu stood in the middle of it all, still vulnerable, still present. I can't ask you to see me as the man I wish I had been, he said. All I can do is show you the man I'm trying to be now. He glanced toward the stage curtain briefly, as if reminding himself not to look for an exit. I've spent my whole life trying to stay out of the spotlight when it wasn't for a role. But this moment, isn't about a role. It's about responsibility. I carried the title of producer. That means something. Or it should. A few quiet nods passed through the crowd. Titles don't mean much if they're only used for credit and never for accountability. He stepped forward again, his voice firmer now, not louder, but with more clarity. If I had spoken up sooner, if I had looked closer, if I had just walked the neighborhood before filming, I might have seen it. The handwritten signs in windows, the empty flower pots on porches that had been recently abandoned, the neighbors who vanished between location meetings. He shook his head. I didn't look, and that's on me. A deep stillness had taken root in the room. No one checked their phones. No one whispered. Even the clicking of cameras had stopped. What was happening on stage wasn't performance. It was confession, and people could feel the difference. "I know you didn't come here for this," he said. "Some of you came to make a point. Others came just to see what I'd do. I don't blame you." He opened his hands slowly, palms up. "But I hope, just maybe, you leave with more than you expected, not because I changed your mind, but because you saw me stop pretending." Pretending. A woman near the front wiped her eyes and leaned into the person next to her. "You okay?" Ian asked. "I thought I hated him," she whispered. Keanu heard nothing of it, but somehow in his final words he answered her anyway. "I didn't come here to protect my name," he said. "I came here to reclaim my voice and to use it for something better than silence." The apology had ended, but Keanu didn't step away. He didn't gesture for applause. He didn't attempt to transition into his planned remarks. He simply stood there, letting the stillness hold everything that had just been said. There was no eruption of clapping, no outburst of forgiveness. Instead, something more powerful unfolded, a respectful, almost sacred hush. It moved through the auditorium like a slow ripple, from the front rows to the balconies. People sat with hands clasped, eyes forward, hearts open but cautious. It wasn't silence out of uncertainty anymore. It was the kind born from shared weight. When the air between people fills with something too human to rush through. Keanu slowly stepped back from the microphone, not to leave the stage, but to create space. He stood just off-center, arms at his sides. It was clear he was waiting, not to be praised, but to be heard in return. From the right side of the audience, a hand went up. It was an older man in a denim jacket. His voice was clear but gentle as he stood. "Why now?" he asked. "Why didn't you respond earlier when people were begging you to?" All heads turned back toward Keanu. He nodded once, not defensively but with acknowledgement. "I ask myself that every night," he said. "At first I thought I was protecting others. My colleagues, the production crew, the people who told me to stay quiet until the facts were clear." He paused. But the truth is, I was protecting myself. There were no gasps, no shifting, just the quiet weight of brutal honesty. I was afraid of saying the wrong thing, afraid of becoming a symbol of the problem, afraid that my apology would come too late, or worse, that it would be seen as insincere. He met the older man's eyes. And so I did what a lot of people do when they're scared. I waited. I hesitated. And in that hesitation, I hurt more people. The man sat down slowly. He didn't smile, but he didn't frown either. He just nodded, eyes lowered, processing. Another hand rose, this time from a young woman near the center. "You talk about learning," she said softly. "But what are you actually going to do?" Keanu turned fully toward her and stepped back to the microphone, this time not to justify, but to begin something new. "I think the most important thing I can do," Keanu said, "is to listen first, and then let the people who were harmed guide the next steps." His voice was steady again, not polished, not rehearsed, but grounded. "I've already committed to meeting with tenant advocates in the neighborhoods affected by the shoot, not for publicity, just to understand what was broken and how I can help rebuild it." The young woman lowered her hand, visibly surprised by the specificity of the answer. "I've also stepped away from 2 upcoming projects," he added. One of them was going to be filmed in another vulnerable area. I said no, not because the story wasn't important, but because I realized we didn't have a plan for protecting the people who already lived there. A murmur of quiet approval moved through a few rows. I'm not stepping away from storytelling, he continued, but I am stepping away from silence. From the left aisle, another attendee spoke up. No microphone, just her voice rising in the quiet. Why didn't you say any of this to the press? Why come here and say it to us instead? Keanu looked over at her. Because you were the ones affected. The press would have given me headlines, but you, he motioned to the audience, you gave me truth, whether I wanted to hear it or not. There was a long pause, then a small voice from the balcony, shaky but strong, spoke next. Did you mean it when you said you weren't asking for forgiveness? Keanu looked up toward the voice. I did, he said, because forgiveness can't be asked for, it can only be offered, and I haven't earned that. His words weren't humble in a way that begged for sympathy. They were resolute, shaped by someone who had thought deeply about what repair really looked like. The air in the room felt less heavy now, but not lighter. It was denser with something else, something quieter than applause and more meaningful than noise. Transparency had replaced tension. The shouting had dissolved into conversation. And where judgment had once filled every inch of space, a new kind of presence was unfolding. Not agreement, not closure, but shared ground. The kind built only through vulnerability and the choice to stay. Keanu looked out over the theater once more. This time, not with hesitation, but with quiet certainty. The crowd that had booed him, challenged him, and nearly driven him off stage now sat with softened shoulders and open eyes. Not because they had forgotten, but because they had been seen. One more hand lifted near the middle. A middle-aged woman stood slowly. Her voice trembled, but not from anger. My sister lived in one of those buildings, she said. She's in a shelter now, she has a baby. No one from the production ever called her. No one checked on her. After she left, the room held its breath. I'm not here for a quote or to be on TV, she continued. I just needed you to know she's still hurting. Keanu's face didn't change. He didn't react with surprise or emotion too big to hold. He just nodded. Thank you, he said. Thank you for saying that. Would you be willing to speak with me after this? Not in front of cameras, just us. She paused, blinking through tears. Yes, she whispered. I would. Someone in the far back, previously silent, stood and spoke without raising a hand. I still don't trust you, but I didn't expect to stay this long. I was going to leave halfway through, but you didn't run. That matters. Keanu offered no defense, only a quiet acknowledgement. I respect that, he replied. He turned back to the mic, then took one more step away. He was no longer just on stage. He was among them, at least in spirit. This isn't a clean ending, he said. It's not a final act where everything is fixed in a monologue. But I didn't come tonight for closure. I came for accountability. One more silence held the room. And if you let me, he added, I'd like to continue the conversation, not from here, he glanced around the grand auditorium, but from wherever you are. Then he stepped back, fully from the microphone, and waited. No dramatic music, no fade to black. Just a room full of people who had arrived expecting confrontation and were now sitting in the wake of something entirely different. Transformation. Not complete, not perfect, but real. As Keanu remained in the soft quiet of that moment, something had clearly shifted. Not just in the crowd, but Broski in him. And just when it felt like the evening might be winding down, one final voice rose from the shadows of the back row. Teenager, he spoke without anger, without force, just a trembling honesty. If someone like you can admit they messed up, then maybe I can too. Heads turned. Even Keanu looked surprised. And in that unexpected sentence, The room learned something deeper. That apologies don't just heal the harmed. Sometimes they teach others how to begin. Keanu stepped forward again, slowly and without fanfare. He scanned the room, then spoke gently into the microphone. "If it's all right," he said, "I'd like to hear from you directly now." Not a murmur of protest followed, not a single jeer. The shift in energy was so complete that the transition into open dialogue felt less like a change of pace and more like a natural next step. Keanu added, "This isn't a press conference. This isn't about cameras or narratives, just your voice and mine." A moment passed. Then a hand lifted near the center. A woman stood tall, composed and clear-eyed. She held no sign, only a notebook clutched against her chest. Her voice rang clearly when she spoke. "My name is Lillian," she said. "I'm a housing advocate from one of the neighborhoods your film crew displaced. I don't need your sympathy, Keanu. What I need is change." Keanu nodded once. "Thank you, Lillian. I appreciate you being here." Lillian continued, "We warned the city council. We filed complaints. We begged for protections for the tenants. But money talks louder than truth. Your production came in with permits and legal coverage, but we were the ones cleaning up the damage after the crew left." She took a breath, eyes steady. A dozen families were scattered across shelters. One man, Henry, he took his own life 3 weeks after his eviction notice. His unit was used for a location shot 2 days after that. The room tensed. Keanu stood still. His face was unreadable at first, then filled with visible grief. He lowered his gaze. "I didn't know about Henry," he said quietly. "I figured you didn't," Lillian replied. "But now you do." Keanu reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a pen and a small notebook. Nothing fancy, just worn paper and ink. "Would you be willing to meet with me after this?" he asked. "To walk me through what your community is facing?" Lillian nodded. "As long as there are no cameras." Keanu looked her in the eye. "Then I'll go alone." A murmur of agreement moved across the audience. It wasn't applause. It was something quieter and stronger. People were beginning to believe he wasn't just talking. He was committing. From the back, another hand rose. An elderly man stood up slowly and asked, "What are you going to do when this all dies down?" Keanu turned toward him, ready to answer. "I'm going to keep showing up," Keanu replied. "Not for the headlines, not for redemption, but for the people who were left behind when the lights went off and the set was torn down." The man nodded thoughtfully and sat down. There was something in his expression. Not forgiveness, not yet, but openness. And that was more than Keanu had dared to hope for. A few rows up, a college-aged man stood and asked, "Would you fund housing protections in the next city where you film? Could that be part of the contract?" Keanu scribbled something in his notebook. "Yes," he said. "That's a real solution. A fund written into the budget, protected by third-party oversight. No film should cost someone their home." He paused, looking up again. "And I'd be happy to start with the next project I'm attached to. No cameras, just a line item in the budget that stays, even if I don't." The young man blinked. "Seriously?" "Seriously," Keanu said. A few quiet chuckles followed, not out of amusement, but from disbelief slowly turning into respect. Then another voice, a woman's, spoke from the second row. She didn't stand. She just leaned forward. "If someone else had said all this," she asked, "would we still be listening?" It was a hard question. Keanu didn't dodge it. "No," he said, "probably not." The room didn't flinch. He added, "And that's part of the problem. Sometimes it takes someone like me, someone with too much attention, to echo what others have been shouting for years." He pointed toward Lillian. "She's been saying this longer than I've known about it. I'm not the hero here. I'm late to the conversation." Lillian nodded once, arms still crossed, but eyes softer now. Someone near the aisle spoke up. "So, what are you going to do with the attention you've got?" Keanu looked at him. Share it, he said simply. Pass the mic. Fund the voices. Step back when it's not my turn. And when it is my turn, make it count. A soft murmur spread again. No buzz of spectacle, no viral soundbite. Just a man, in front of hundreds, being honest and reachable. A woman near the side wall raised her hand. Do you still want to act? Keanu smiled faintly. I do, but only if the stories we tell don't harm the people who live where we film them. Another man stood, this time closer to the front. He looked hesitant, his hand trembling slightly as he held a crumpled pamphlet from the protest outside. My name's Ray, he said. I lost my apartment when your crew came. I slept in my car for 4 nights. I've had a hard time forgiving anyone involved. The room went still again. I believe you're sorry, Ray said, but I don't know what I'm supposed to do with that. Keanu nodded slowly. You're not supposed to do anything with it, Ray, he replied. It's mine to carry, not yours to resolve. That answer hit like a stone dropped in calm water. Ray stared at him for a moment, then gave a quiet nod and sat back down. From the balcony, a voice called, Will you visit the shelter where my mom ended up? Keanu shaded his eyes to see the speaker. Tell me where it is, and I will. Alone. A pause. Then the speaker responded. Okay. No one clapped. No one stood. But a new rhythm was forming. One of small bridges, one truth at a time. Keanu looked down at the notebook again. It was nearly full now. Page after page, written not from a script, but from everything he had heard in the last 30 minutes. Finally, someone asked the question everyone else had been dancing around. Do you still think you deserve to be up there? Keanu didn't flinch. No, he said, but I do think I have a responsibility to stay here as long as I'm needed. He looked around the room one last time. This stage doesn't belong to me, he continued. It never did. It belongs to the people who were brave enough to speak up when it would have been easier to stay quiet. He turned to Lillian, to Ray, to the woman who mentioned her sister in the shelter. This belongs to you, he said, and for a moment, it did. No dramatic ending, no applause cue, just quiet respect as Keanu stepped aside from the mic, not leaving the stage, but no longer centered on it. Oh. He remained off to the left, notebook still in hand, listening, not as a celebrity, not as a savior, just as someone willing to be accountable. And finally, the room responded, not with noise, but with trust. Keanu stood quietly at the edge of the stage, the small notebook still in his hand. He looked down at it, flipping past the ink-filled pages, absorbing the names, the raw truths, and the questions that had shaped the past hour. His prepared speech, the neatly folded pages resting in his inner jacket pocket, remained untouched. He reached inside and pulled it out slowly, gazing down at the carefully written words he'd rehearsed for days. Then, gently, he refolded the paper and tucked it back into his jacket. I think you all gave me what I really needed to say, he said into the microphone, voice calm and final. There was no applause, no fanfare, but something more powerful filled the room. Reverent silence. Row by row, people stood, not for a standing ovation, not out of habit, but out of quiet respect for what had just taken place. A filmmaker from the third row rose slowly, lowering the camera strap from his neck. He had come ready to capture a dramatic exit. Instead, he left the lens capped. A journalist closed her laptop, hands trembling slightly. She didn't type her headline. Not yet. She had witnessed something unexpected, something she didn't want to reduce to a quote. As Keanu turned to leave the stage, his footsteps echoed lightly across the wooden floor. No security surrounded him, no handlers rushed in. He walked with deliberate calm, the way he had entered. Only now, something had shifted. He reached the curtain and paused. A soft whisper came from the audience. It wasn't loud enough for most to hear, but those nearby caught it. That was real, someone said. Another voice added, That wasn't acting. Backstage, one of the event organizers stood near the side rail, a headset still looped around her neck. She wiped her cheek with the back of her hand, quickly trying to compose herself. Her name tag had curled slightly from nervous fingers. She had worked this summit for years, managed dozens of celebrities, politicians, and industry titans, but none had ever made her cry. Keanu gave her a slight nod as he passed. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. He just acknowledged her with quiet understanding, then continued down the hallway. The technician at the lighting console looked over at a colleague. "Do we cue the outro music?" The stage manager shook her head. "Let the silence play." Back in the auditorium, the audience remained on their feet, not moving, not leaving, just standing in a kind of stillness that couldn't be orchestrated. There was no push for photos, no scramble to the exits. The energy in the room had changed, not just in tone, but in temperature. The cold distance that had once filled the space was now replaced with something warmer, an unspoken connection. In the upper balcony, a young man who had live-streamed the earlier protest looked down at his phone. The comments were still pouring in, but he turned the stream off. He realized the story couldn't be captured in pixels. It needed reflection, not reaction. One of the community leaders who had spoken earlier, Lillian, remained seated, her hands folded in her lap. Her notebook sat beside her, closed but not forgotten. She didn't need to speak again. She had said what needed saying, and she had been heard. The teenager who had spoken near the end wiped his face with his sleeve, then slowly picked up his sign from the floor. Instead of holding it up again, he turned it over. The blank side faced the ceiling now, as if symbolizing something undone and ready to be rewritten. Behind the curtain, Keanu made his way down a quiet hallway toward the back exit. Every step was deliberate, grounded. He wasn't rushing to escape. He was moving with the same presence that had carried him through every moment on stage. One of the young volunteers stood at the exit door, headset slightly askew. She looked up as he approached, startled to see him without any entourage. "You," she started, unsure of what to say. He paused beside her and offered a small nod. "You did great work tonight," he said gently. "Thank you for holding the space." Her eyes widened. She had spent the entire event in backstage chaos, taking cues, following scripts, keeping schedules. No one had acknowledged her until now. She smiled, holding back emotion. "Thank you." Keanu nodded again and walked through the door, stepping out into the night. Outside, no press waited. No cameras clicked. The street was quiet. A few people lingered nearby, but they didn't approach. They just watched him go, uncertain of what had just unfolded, but certain that it mattered. He didn't look back, because the message had already been left behind, and it was louder than anything he could have read. Back inside the venue, no one had reached for their coat just yet. It wasn't inertia, it was reverence. Something rare had just happened, and no one wanted to be the first to break it. A few attendees sat back down slowly, as if needing to remain a little longer in that space. Not to hear more, but to feel it one last time. One woman, seated near the center, gently closed her notebook without writing a final line. She stared at the empty page, then placed the pen across it and folded her hands. Her colleague leaned in. "What do you think that was?" she asked quietly. The woman didn't answer right away. Then, in a voice almost too soft to hear, she said, "Accountability." Behind the stage, a small team gathered in the production hallway. The lighting techs, the sound crew, the event planner, people whose work was usually invisible. No one said much. They just stood quietly, absorbing what they'd witnessed. One of the audio engineers finally spoke. "I've worked this job for 19 years, he said, "and I've never seen an entire room fall quiet without being asked." Another replied, "It felt like the room forgave itself." No one argued. In the control booth, a young woman clicked "Stop recording" on the main console. She sat back in her chair, blinking fast. She hadn't realized her hand had been shaking the whole time, In the foyer, someone left a folded piece of paper on the information table. It wasn't official feedback, just a message scribbled in pen. I came angry. I'm still angry, but I think I might be ready to speak now. The summit's director, Sarah Ortega, stood alone in the empty green room. The catering staff had cleared the dishes, the chairs had been stacked, and still she remained, one hand pressed against her chest. Tears ran down her cheeks, but she didn't wipe them. She thought about all the times she had introduced speakers with perfectly rehearsed messages. Nothing had ever pierced the air like what she had just seen. Outside, Keanu walked past a city bench, a flickering street lamp, and an empty stretch of sidewalk. He didn't call a car. He didn't make a call. He simply kept walking, alone, quiet, changed. And behind him, in that darkened auditorium, hundreds of people carried something new. Not closure, but a message. One left behind by a man who never opened his speech. Because he didn't need to. There was no official video, no camera crew was allowed to stream the event. Phones had been collected at the doors, no media coverage was authorized, and no transcripts were released. But by the next morning, everyone in Hollywood knew something had happened. It began with a simple tweet. I saw Keanu Reeves say sorry like a real man. Not a star, not a spokesperson, just a human being. The tweet came from a young actor named Max Dorsey, someone still climbing the ladder. He had attended the summit because his mentor pulled a string. He sat in the 12th row, expecting glamour, prepared for another speech filled with big phrases and safe applause. Instead, he witnessed something raw, something uncomfortable, and something unforgettable. His post didn't go viral. It didn't need to. It started a ripple. Within hours, more posts followed. A costume designer wrote, I didn't think anything could surprise me anymore, but last night I watched a man walk through protest signs and answer hatred with stillness. A film school student posted a thread, you won't find the clip, they didn't allow phones, but I was there, and I watched an entire auditorium of critics go quiet, not because they were impressed, but because they were seen. By midday, coffee trucks on studio lots were buzzing. Makeup trailers whispered with curiosity. A veteran grip on a Paramount shoot was overheard saying, Keanu just earned more respect than any Oscar could ever buy. It wasn't just the story that traveled, it was the tone. Not one person who passed the message on made it about shock value. They didn't dramatize it or exaggerate it. They told it softly, with a kind of reverence. Someone at a talent agency mentioned it during a staff meeting. A junior agent said, I heard he didn't even use his speech, just listened and owned it. The room fell still for a beat. Then someone quietly replied, maybe that's what real power looks like. By the end of the day, even directors who had once dismissed Keanu as too quiet, too private, too safe were reconsidering what that quietness meant. It wasn't passive, deliberate, and people began to understand that, not through headlines, but through whispers. At a casting call in Burbank, two young actresses waited in folding chairs, scripts in hand. One of them leaned over and whispered, "Did you hear what Keanu did at the summit?" The other nodded. My roommate was volunteering, said the whole crowd turned on him, and he didn't flinch, just stood there, then apologized for something he didn't even do. A man waiting nearby lowered his phone. That's not what I heard. I heard he told them about being evicted as a teenager, said it's why he took the role in the first place. They fell silent, not from awkwardness, but because there was nothing more to add. Some stories don't need embellishment, they settle in the bones. At a post-production house on Sunset, a sound editor paused her work. She turned to her coworker and said, "You ever think about how rare it is to hear a real apology in this business?" Her coworker nodded slowly. Most people just post a statement, hire a PR team, deny until it blows over. Not him. No, he walked into fire and didn't throw water. He just stood there, took the heat. The comment spread to the animation department, then over to a nearby effects studio, where a junior compositor muttered while masking a frame, "That's the kind of man who understands consequence." Later that evening, a bar in West Hollywood filled with young creators and executives sipping cocktails between meetings. One table of indie producers sat huddled over their drinks. A woman in her late 30s leaned forward and said, "Okay, I wasn't going to say anything, but my cousin works events. She said after Keanu walked off stage, no one spoke for 5 minutes. Another added, "I heard even the crew cried." And just like that, the table went quiet. None of them were there, but they all felt like they had been. In another corner, an older man, gray at the temples, a screenwriter from the old school, sat back in his chair and said, "It's not just what he did, it's that he didn't run from it." The younger producer looked puzzled. "Run from what, the film?" "No," the man said softly, "from being seen." The comment didn't need follow-up. It hovered in the air, true in its simplicity. That night, as a half-dozen industry newsletters tried to verify what had actually happened at the summit, none could find footage. But that didn't matter, because the story had already outpaced the headlines. Over the next several days, something unusual happened. Despite there being no footage, no transcript, and no formal article, the story of what happened at the summit kept spreading, not because it was promoted, but because people couldn't stop talking about it. In makeup chairs, on studio sets, in cramped writers' rooms, and over post-wrap dinners, the same quiet message came up again and again. Helm didn't defend himself, he just listened, owned it, with no PR script. A studio security guard told a colleague. They said he put the speech back in his pocket, didn't even use it. On a college film forum, a student wrote, "I wasn't there, but I know someone who was, and they said it felt like watching someone tell the truth for the first time. It wasn't loud, it didn't trend, but it stuck." In a world where every moment is recorded and every mistake dissected, Keanu's silence and honesty created something rare. He didn't fix the problem with a speech. He made people feel seen by showing he had been blind. And slowly, one conversation at a time, people stopped calling him perfect. They started calling him real. A week later, early on a gray Tuesday morning, a quiet figure stepped out of a rideshare vehicle near a worn-out sidewalk in the Mission District. Keanu Reeves didn't wear sunglasses, a hat, or anything designed to deflect attention. Just a plain hoodie, soft jeans, and the same quiet demeanor that had become his unintentional armor. There were no photographers, no handlers, no press vans following behind. He hadn't alerted anyone from his team. The visit hadn't been scheduled, promoted, or planned with community organizers. It was exactly what he had promised at the summit. A visit with no cameras. Alone. The housing complex loomed before him, an aging, weather-stained structure tucked between two new high-rises. Its cracked paint and rusting railings stood in stark contrast to the glassy condos just a block away. Yet, this was the heart of it all, the place that had turned his name into a headline and a protest into a roar. A woman sweeping her porch looked up as he approached, her brows furrowed. Then her eyes widened slightly. "You're..." she began and stopped herself. He opened the Keanu door. Keanu nodded once. "I'm not here to make a speech," he said quietly. "I'm here to listen." She stared for a beat, then gestured toward a row of benches under a drooping jacaranda tree. "You can sit. We talk out here in the mornings." Soon, others joined, some skeptical, some curious. No one raised their voices. They asked why he came. He said simply, "Because I needed to see it for myself." A man in his 50s pointed at the construction site across the street. "That used to be a school," he said. "Now it's luxury condos. They promised no one would be forced out, but then your film came. And suddenly we had letters on our doors." Keanu didn't interrupt. He didn't explain. He didn't offer a defense. He pulled out a small black notebook and wrote down every word. A teenage girl leaned against the building with her arms folded. My grandma lived here since I was born. She died last month, thinking she'd lost her home. You ever think about that? He looked up at her, his eyes tired but sincere. I do now, he said softly. She didn't smile, but she didn't look away. More residents gathered. Some just watched, some spoke. Keanu didn't ask for names. He didn't bring any promises. Only presence. A presence rare enough to feel real. As the morning stretched on, Keanu remained seated under the jacaranda tree, its purple blossoms gently falling around him. The neighborhood was slowly waking up, but no one rushed him. Word began to spread through the complex that he was there, not filming, not donating, just there. A middle-aged woman named Letitia brought him a folding chair. You don't have to sit on concrete, she said. He thanked her and accepted without fuss. She sat next to him and began telling her story. Her youngest son had to switch schools 3 times in 2 years because of housing instability. Her husband, who once worked maintenance in the very same building, had to take a job 2 counties away to afford rent. She didn't cry. She didn't complain. She just spoke. And Keanu wrote. Occasionally, he looked up and nodded, acknowledging something in her voice, something that reminded him of the struggles his own mother once faced when they were forced to leave their apartment decades ago. But he didn't insert himself into her pain. He allowed it to breathe. A young mother appeared with her toddler, who waddled toward Keanu curiously. The boy held a crumpled piece of paper clutched in his small hand. Without a word, he placed it on Keanu's knee, then stepped back and hid behind his mother's leg. Keanu unfolded it. It was a child's drawing of an apartment. Stick figures in the windows, a sun with a smile, a tree with roots drawn extra long. That's our place, the boy's mother said, her voice hushed. My son's way of remembering home. Keanu held the picture for a moment, eyes tracing the messy lines. Then he reached into his notebook and gently folded the drawing inside. I'll keep it, he said. Thank you. The mother nodded, blinking back tears. By late morning, people had begun bringing chairs from their homes to join the informal circle. Some still sat quietly, others took the opportunity to speak. A few challenged him. One older man asked him directly, So, what are you going to do about it? Keanu looked at him, then at the others. I don't have an answer today, he said, but this is where answers start. The man nodded slowly, then muttered, At least you showed up. That simple phrase carried weight, because in a city used to being promised and forgotten, someone had finally shown up, with no speech, no fanfare, and no script. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the sidewalk, Keanu stood and quietly thanked the group. No one asked him for a selfie. No one handed him a business card. He had made it clear this wasn't about publicity. A young girl who had been silent the entire time approached him as he turned to leave. She looked no older than 10. In her hand was a torn notebook page, folded in half. My brother drew this too, she whispered. Keanu crouched down, receiving the page with both hands. It showed a small rooftop with stars above it. 2 stick figures held hands on top, one with long hair, one with short. Above them, a speech bubble read, Still here. He looked at it for a moment, then folded it and placed it gently inside his journal, next to the first drawing. That's a beautiful story, he said softly. The girl gave a shy smile and ran back to her building. Keanu didn't make a statement before leaving. He didn't gather everyone for a group moment. He simply nodded to the people still gathered and walked quietly back toward the street. Someone from a second-floor window called out, Thank you for coming. He raised his hand once in reply. Then he disappeared into the city. But since a month had passed since the summit in San Francisco, headlines had moved on, the protests faded into memory, and the world, true to form, kept spinning. But in the background, away from the cameras and trending hashtags, something else had begun quietly taking shape. In a modest office tucked into the corner of a legal aid nonprofit in Los Angeles, a man named Javier received an unexpected call. It was from a well-regarded private foundation that occasionally funded local housing work. But this time, the voice on the other end said something different. "There's a new fund being created," the woman explained. "It's focused specifically on communities displaced by commercial filming activity, especially when production unknowingly contributes to gentrification or eviction." Javier blinked. He'd been in housing justice for over a decade, and no one had ever addressed that problem directly. "It's called the Shelter Stories Fund," she continued, "and you're one of the first groups being offered a grant." Javier leaned back in his chair. "Who's behind it?" There was a pause, then the woman replied, "The founder chose to remain anonymous, but the initial donation is $1 million. The number stunned him. Groups like his often survived on scraps. Small grants, emergency donations, last-minute fundraisers, just to keep the lights on. $1 million could keep outreach alive for years. It could fund legal support for dozens of evicted families. It could even provide emergency relocation services. That night, he mentioned the news to a close friend in the advocacy community. Word spread in whispers, not just that money had come in, but that something deeper was at play. A gesture not meant for headlines. Meanwhile, across town, a small, discreet law firm handled the paperwork. The Shelter Stories Fund was registered as a donor-advised initiative under a nondescript trust name. Even internally, only a few knew who had made the first contribution. Weeks later, a freelance journalist named Maya Patel, who had been covering housing rights for years, stumbled onto the name while researching a piece about sudden funding shifts in Los Angeles's eviction response system. She noticed something unusual. Several nonprofits, all in different zip codes with different missions, had quietly received grants in the last month. The only connection was a line of fine print buried in each one, Shelter Stories Fund. It wasn't a familiar name to her. She did what journalists do. She called, she emailed, she showed up at office doors. And what she uncovered surprised her more than she expected. One nonprofit director admitted, "We don't even know where it came from, just that the support is unrestricted, no strings." Another added, "Whoever's behind it clearly understands the issue. This isn't just charity, it's repair." That phrase stuck with Maya. Repair, not relief, not optics. After digging through legal filings and donation records, she traced the founding trust back to a small LLC linked to a legal assistant once associated with Keanu Reeves's longtime personal counsel. That was the thread. And it unraveled quickly. In an email, Maya reached out for confirmation. To her shock, she received a reply. Not from a publicist, but from Keanu himself. The email was short, only 2 lines. "Yes, I started it. Because listening doesn't need a spotlight." That was all he wrote. No quote approval, no media request. When Maya published the story, it wasn't the headline that caught attention. It was the closing paragraph. Never held a press conference, never tweeted the link. He didn't even put his name on the paperwork. But in the middle of silence, he left a trace. A fund, shaped by what he heard. People didn't share the article for drama. They shared it because something about it felt real, quiet, but undeniable. Inside film studios, the story became a quiet conversation, not just about Keanu Reeves, but about how the industry handled its impact. A veteran location manager forwarded the article to her team with a note that simply read, "Let's do better." Another producer sent a late-night email to a director, suggesting they rethink where their next project would shoot and how they'd engage with the neighborhood first. The Shelter Stories Fund continued its work quietly. By the 3rd month, it had helped families in Oakland secure temporary housing after an indie shoot raised rent prices on an entire block. A community organizer in Chicago used a portion of the grant to publish a guide for filmmakers on ethical production practices in vulnerable neighborhoods. None of these efforts bore Keanu's name. That was intentional. He never spoke of it again in public. But one day, a boy in a Los Angeles shelter recognized him during a volunteer reading event. The boy looked up from a dog-eared book and said, "You're the guy from my brother's drawing." Keanu's expression changed. He smiled softly and sat next to him. "Your brother gave me something really special," he said. They talked for a while, not about fame or movies, but about what it felt like to be moved out of your home, to leave behind toys, to sleep in a strange place. Keanu didn't offer answers, only his presence, just like he had at the summit, just like he had on that quiet visit weeks earlier. Later that night, a staff member at the shelter found a folded note tucked between the pages of the boy's sketchbook. It simply read, "Still here." No name, no message, just that. By then, the Shelter Stories Fund had already begun receiving outside donations. Other actors, a few crew members, even a costume designer from a daytime show sent a small check with a note, "For the people behind the story." What started as an apology had become a movement. Not one led by press releases or applause, but one powered by humility, memory, and the kind of listening that doesn't need a spotlight. 2 weeks after the article about the Shelter Stories Fund had quietly made waves online, something even quieter began happening. A young activist named Elise, who had stood in the third row during the summit protest, came home one afternoon to find an envelope tucked between the bars of her front gate. There was no stamp, no return address, just her name written in neat handwriting across the front. Inside was a single sheet of paper, thick and unlined, folded in thirds. The message was brief. "Elise, I've thought about what you said every day since. I still don't have a good answer, but I'm searching." Keanu. She froze. She hadn't expected anything. During the summit, she'd been one of the loudest critics. Her question, sharp and direct, had echoed across the auditorium. How can someone so rich, so visible, not see what's happening in his name? She never got a full reply that night. Only that glance, the one where his eyes softened but didn't retreat. Now, this. She posted a picture of the letter's corner online, keeping most of it private. Her caption read, "I wasn't expecting a reply, but I got one." Other people began chiming in. A grad student in Oakland posted a blurry image of her envelope, captioned, "Hand-delivered, no signature inside. Just understanding." Another shared a letter that read, "You challenged me without anger. That's hard to do. I admire that." Each note was different. None of them were grand apologies. None of them defended his choices. They were reflections. Sometimes only a few lines, sometimes several paragraphs, always handwritten. The letters didn't come with fanfare. In fact, no one ever received more than one. There were no emails, no invites, no announcements, just letters, and word spread in whispers. One recipient, a former tenant named Jorge, had been among the most furious voices at the summit. He hadn't shouted that night, but his silence had burned. He had stood with arms crossed, eyes narrowed, refusing to clap or even blink when Keanu spoke. Weeks later, Jorge found a small envelope left on his apartment mailbox. Inside was a short note. "Jorge, I heard your silence. It said more than any sign. Thank you for not walking out. I don't know if I deserve your patience, but I wanted you to know I felt it. Keanu." Jorge didn't post the letter at first. He showed it to his sister, who cried while reading it aloud. She had been the one forced to pack up her daughter's baby crib during their eviction. For her, it was never about the celebrity. It was about being seen. Really seen. She'd posted a photo of the letter, not for attention, but to remind others that their voices hadn't gone into a void. Soon, a quiet community began forming online. People began searching for others who had received similar notes. They weren't comparing messages. They weren't measuring who got more. They were simply connecting over the fact that someone had written to them, personally, with care. A young woman named Trina, who had spoken at the summit about growing up in shelters, received a letter that included a line from her own speech, something she thought no one had paid attention to. You said, "Sometimes being poor means never being heard." You were right, and I'm still listening. That letter became one of the most shared images on social media that month. Not because of who it was from, but because of what it acknowledged. It validated a truth millions of people carried but rarely voiced, that being heard is not just about volume. It's about being remembered. These weren't publicity stunts. No news outlet reported them. No one from Keanu's team confirmed or denied anything. That was the strange part. There was nothing official about it, just one human writing to another. In the weeks that followed, more letters surfaced. Not all went viral. Some were posted in private forums, others quietly mentioned during community meetings or shared among friends. A few were never shared at all, kept folded inside journals, taped to mirrors, or tucked into glove compartments like something sacred. Keanu never commented publicly. He never confirmed the letters existed, never gave an interview, and never repeated the gestures. But the impact deepened. One man, a middle-aged teacher named Darius, who had once taught a housing rights course, received a note that simply read, "You reminded me that dignity isn't about appearances, it's about standing in the storm without running. I'm grateful you were there that night." Darius had spoken during the open dialogue portion of the summit, saying he didn't expect perfection from public figures, but he did expect presence. He had no idea it had landed. The handwriting on the note was unmistakably the same as the others. Calm, intentional, a little uneven, but personal. In private circles across Los Angeles, people began referring to the letters not as apologies, but as acknowledgments. That mattered. These weren't attempts to erase criticism. They didn't ask for forgiveness. They didn't try to explain anything away. They simply met people where they had spoken. A woman named Aisha, who ran a grassroots eviction prevention nonprofit, described hers as a message that felt like someone opened the window just enough to let in air. She framed it and hung it in her office, not because of who wrote it, but because of what it represented. Change, starting without a spotlight. Some letters arrived weeks after the summit. A few arrived months later. The delay didn't lessen their weight. If anything, it made people feel like they weren't being checked off a list, but considered. And then, just as quietly as it began, the stream of letters stopped. But by then, they had done something remarkable. The noise that had once surrounded Keanu's name in connection with the controversy had been replaced by something else. Conversation, not silence. People were no longer shouting into voids. They were speaking with each other, sharing their experiences, and continuing the work they had already started, long before the summit ever happened. And in the center of it all, without fanfare or a single official press release, was a man who had listened, responded, and then disappeared from the conversation, leaving space for others to take the stage. It began with a whisper in the production offices. One mid-judge drama preparing to shoot in East Los Angeles quietly added a new role to its staff: Community Impact Liaison. The job description was simple: listen before filming. Meet with residents, understand local concerns, report back to the producers before a single camera rolled. No press release, no photo op, just a shift. The next week, another show followed. This one, filming in the Bay Area, added a full-time community relations coordinator whose sole task was to ensure transparency between the film crew and the people living in the area. The producers cited a growing awareness of the human footprint left behind. When a local paper asked if this change was related to the controversy at the summit, one producer said, "It's not just about that moment. It's about how that moment made us all look in the mirror." More shifts followed, quiet ones. Actors began requesting detailed information about the filming locations included in their call sheets. not just for logistics, but to understand where they were working. Was it a displaced neighborhood? Was it near a shelter, a school, or a housing complex with concerns? On one large studio film, a supporting actor asked to visit the neighborhood council before filming his scenes. He wasn't famous, but when asked why, he simply said, "Keanu did it without a camera. Why shouldn't I?" The conversation that began as protest turned into policy. Studio heads, once distant from these conversations, found themselves pulled into meetings about location ethics and social responsibility. Some resisted at first, but when one of the most powerful studio executives in Hollywood stood at an internal town hall and said, "Keanu raised the bar without shouting," it landed differently. There was no accusation in the room, just quiet acknowledgement that something had changed. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't loud, but the message was clear. Glistening was no longer optional. Before you did. Soon, the changes started showing up in contracts, not just clauses about location damages, but new addendums requiring post-filming community assessments. For years, production teams had moved into neighborhoods like storms, fast, bright, and gone before anyone could ask questions. Now, studios were being asked to leave something behind besides footprints and trash bins. One studio quietly pledged that every production moving forward would include a follow-up meeting with the community it had impacted. They didn't advertise it, they didn't even mention Keanu's name. But everyone on the inside knew what had sparked the shift. Writers' rooms weren't immune to the transformation either. Screenwriters began challenging storylines that romanticized poverty while filming in actual struggling neighborhoods. One senior writer, speaking during a pitch meeting, asked, "If we're filming in someone's backyard, shouldn't their story be respected too?" More and more, those working behind the camera began feeling empowered to speak up, not out of fear of public backlash, but out of a renewed sense of responsibility. A first assistant director on a major set wrote anonymously in a crew forum, "Keanu didn't blame anyone else. He didn't defend the project. He just listened." That hit me harder than any lecture ever could. Actors too began to take note. Some began asking to meet with advocacy groups before taking roles tied to real-life social issues. A well-known star turned down a lead role in a blockbuster because the location had recently been the center of a gentrification battle. When pressed, they answered plainly, "I'm not going to pretend this isn't someone's real pain." Hollywood was still far from perfect. Many changes were still surface level. Some studios resisted, trying to wait out the wave of accountability. But something deeper had been set in motion, a cultural shift. Not because of rules or fear, but because of one moment on a stage, where a man chose vulnerability over performance. In the months that followed, panel discussions at film schools took on a new tone. Instead of just asking, "How do you make a great movie?" students began asking, "How do you make a great movie without hurting someone in the process?" Professors who once focused only on cinematic techniques now wove in ethics, impact, and empathy. A new generation of creators emerged, directors, screenwriters, producers, who saw storytelling not only as a form of art, but as an act of responsibility. Many of them referenced that infamous summit in San Francisco. Some had been in the room, others had only heard stories. But all of them pointed to the same figure. Not as a hero, not as a martyr, but as a reminder. Keanu's decision to show up and listen, without excuses, without handlers, without spin, had become a benchmark, not because it was perfect, but because it was human. Back in the studio boardrooms, one executive who had previously dismissed concerns about location displacement had a change of heart. She had read one of the protester letters Keanu had responded to personally. She kept it taped at the back of her notebook, though she never spoke of it. One day, when discussing a potential location in a struggling neighborhood, she paused mid-sentence and said, "We're not just borrowing their streets, we're borrowing their story." That shift, subtle, almost imperceptible to the outside world, was the real legacy. It wasn't about trending hashtags or viral clips. It wasn't even about the Shelter Stories Fund, though it continued to grow behind the scenes. It was about how one act of humility, one honest moment in the face of condemnation, had opened the door for an entire industry to rethink its habits. And people noticed. Not just insiders, not just activists, but everyday people watching from afar. Parents who had been displaced, volunteers who had been ignored, viewers who had once felt invisible. For the first time, they saw someone stand on a stage and say, "I'm sorry," and actually mean it. The transformation wasn't overnight, but it was lasting. And while Keanu Reeves never claimed credit and never returned to speak about the summit again, his quiet decision to take responsibility had rippled outward into places he'd never see. Behind the camera, in front of the lens, and deep within the conscience of an industry built on storytelling. It had been months since that night, but the memory remained vivid in Keanu's mind. Not for the shouting, not for the flashing lights, but for the silence that followed. That moment when the room paused, not out of agreement or approval, but out of something deeper. Recognition. Maybe even respect. He thought about the first seconds after stepping onto that stage. The sound of boos crashing like waves, the heat of judgment washing over him. The temptation to defend himself, to shout back, to demand fairness. But he didn't. He had just stood there, still, quiet. In the stillness, he had found something he hadn't expected: clarity. He remembered closing his eyes, not to escape the room, but to center himself in it. He had asked nothing of the crowd, not understanding, not forgiveness, just space to be honest. And what he received in return was more than approval. It was change. Real, slow, difficult change. He didn't see the night as a humiliation. He saw it as a turning point, a moment where his silence wasn't weakness, but choice. It would have been easier to walk off, to cancel, to blame others. But that's not what the moment asked of him. It asked him to stay. That was the lesson. In an age where noise often drowns out meaning, where reaction replaces reflection, stillness had become a radical act. He didn't give a speech that night, at least not the one he'd written. What he offered instead was something messier, riskier: himself. Unfiltered, vulnerable, present. And that was the real message. He thought about the folded speech, still tucked in a drawer in his office. He had reread it once, weeks later. It was well-crafted, poised, perfectly rehearsed. But it hadn't been what the moment needed. That night needed truth, not polish. It needed someone to say, "I don't have the answers, but I'm here anyway." Keanu had walked through anger, sat with pain. He hadn't tried to fix it, only to acknowledge it. After the summit, Keanu had quietly returned to his life. There were no interviews, no clarifying statements. He let the moment speak for itself. He didn't need the spotlight to validate the truth of what had happened. But something else followed. Not praise, not publicity, but presence. Quiet messages from actors he'd never met. Letters from students. A folded note left on his trailer door by a young director that simply read, "Thank you for not walking away." It wasn't about being right anymore. It was about staying human in the face of being misunderstood. And perhaps that was the greater victory. Keanu didn't consider himself brave. He considered himself lucky. Lucky that the crowd gave him a second chance to show who he was. Lucky that the fire didn't consume him, but refined him. Because what could have been a fall from grace had instead become something else entirely, a moment of growth. He learned something powerful that night. When a person listens without defending, when they stand still without running, they become a mirror. And sometimes people just need to see their reflection in someone who's willing to be wrong, willing to learn, willing to stay in the discomfort until it passes. It was never about perfection. It was about presence. And that presence started a ripple. In the months that followed, more stories like his began to surface. Artists choosing to show up to hard conversations. Filmmakers reevaluating their community impact. People realizing that accountability didn't have to be public shaming, it could be shared responsibility. Keanu had never planned to become a symbol. But maybe that's how real symbols are born. Not through intention, but through action. Quiet, steady, unrehearsed action. And that's what he wanted people to remember. Years later, when someone mentioned the night of the summit, Keanu didn't flinch. He didn't wince or deflect. Instead, he looked out the window, thought for a moment, and said softly, "That was the night I chose to stand still." He didn't mean physically, he meant something deeper. He meant that in a moment when everything in him wanted to explain, defend, or disappear, he had made a different choice. He stayed, not because he had the perfect words, not because he had a strategy, but because it felt right to simply face what was in front of him. He recalled how the lights seemed too bright, how the auditorium had felt like a wall of judgment. He remembered the silence that eventually followed the storm, and he remembered one particular protester who had tears in her eyes, even as she held her sign. "That's what stayed with me the most," he later said. "Not the noise, but the emotion behind it. The pain, the disappointment, the truth." He never did open that speech. In fact, the paper remained folded neatly in the inside pocket of the jacket he wore that night. It moved with him from home to home. Sometimes he'd reach into that pocket by accident and feel its crisp edges. And he'd smile, not with regret, but with gratitude, because the words he never spoke had made room for something more real. The apology he gave wasn't rehearsed, the answers he offered weren't polished, but they were honest, and that made all the difference. In a world full of noise, he would later reflect, quiet accountability speaks loudest. That night didn't trend. There were no hashtags, no viral clips. The summit had banned recording for privacy reasons, and no official footage was ever released. But the memory of what happened traveled anyway, through word of mouth, through handwritten letters, through small shifts in how people showed up in meetings and film sets and public spaces. It changed conversations. It softened egos. It planted seeds. There was no climax, no dramatic redemption arc, just a man who showed up, listened, and chose not to run from discomfort. And maybe that's the real story. That change doesn't always come with a bang. Sometimes it arrives with a whisper, with a deep breath, with someone choosing to say, "I was wrong," when they didn't have to. So if this story touched something in you, if you've ever witnessed someone change your perspective, not by dominating the room, but by humbling themselves, share your story in the comments. Let this space be a place where we remember that humanity matters more than image. And if you believe that listening can heal, that humility has a place in leadership, and that stories like this deserve to be told, subscribe to this channel. We're here to bring you more incredible stories like this one. Stories that don't just entertain, but remind us who we are and who we can become. Thank you for being here. We'll see you in the next story.